Now, for the next 40 minutes or so, we move on to our panel discussion. And here I'm going to ask up to the stage our two panellists. Unfortunately, we had planned a slightly larger panel for you, but unfortunately, wind and the disruption to plane traffic has had some impact on that. But I am assured that our two panellists that we do have are going to be perfectly well able to make up for any deficiencies in numbers. So would you please welcome to the stage, and could I ask to join us now, Thomas J. Donoghue. You've already heard Tom refer to. He's the President and Chief Executive of the American Chamber of Commerce since 1997, and previously he served for 13 years as President and Chief Executive of the American Trucking Associations, the national organisation of the trucking industry. And can I also welcome Hendrik Bourgeois. He's the current chair of AmCham EU. In addition, he leads General Electric's European Government Affairs team, responsible for the government affairs and policy for General Electric, I beg your pardon, that's a Freudian slip, towards the European Union and the European government institutions. So what we are going to do to begin with, gentlemen, when you're seated and comfortable, if you would care to sit over there, Henrik, just for the far side of the top. And Adrian van den Hove from Business Europe, you are so welcome. And I can only apologise that I didn't give you the introduction you deserve. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. As I say, we really do appreciate the flexibility of people who've been able to step in at the last minute here. What I'm going to do is ask each of our panellists, particularly given what we've heard for the past hour or so, to give us their reflections, particularly on this marriage that will hopefully be brought together if the mandates that are required are processed over the next couple of months and these talks do begin in the summer. So maybe Tom, you kick us off with your reflections.
Here or there?
Wherever you're most comfortable.
Maybe I'll come up there for 2 minutes. Well, thank you very much. There are a lot of skills that it takes to get one of these done, and you have demonstrated here perhaps the most significant, and that is persistence. We started sometime early this morning going from event to event on this subject, and we have been working on our arguments, and they're getting better and better. So if we keep going for a while, I think we'll be ahead. You know, the event that was organized by the U.S. Chamber and our partners here in Ireland was more than I expected. There were a lot of people there. The questions were interesting. Mike came and spoke. He was quite good because he was definitive. For a long period of time, while they were running this high-level review of the potential of such an agreement, when we were going to start was a subject that he tried to bob and weave. I thought today he was very clear, very specific, and I believe when we listened to the extraordinary speakers from the EU, I thought we heard the same thing. This is something that we're going to do and that we're going to start and give it an official kickoff in June. Having all of that, perhaps the most interesting conclusion of our meeting was to have the chairman of the parliamentary committee responsible for all of the final determinations in the EU on such an agreement. Conclusion, last sentence was, we're going to do it. Getting there and the roadmap that he laid out and the obstructions that would have to be dealt with was one of the better pieces of work or arguments that I've heard, and I suggested to the organizers of our meeting that we transcribe what he had to say and get it out and around, because I think with that kind of knowledge, along with the excellent work of the people both in the EU and in Mike's office, we'll get there in a bit of a orderly way, and we'll avoid a lot of steps or missteps along the process. By the way, this isn't going to be easy. Watching the negotiation of this agreement is going to be ugly, but we have to keep persistent, have to keep optimistic, and have to stay after it. So when I leave here tomorrow, Saturday morning, we're going to London, and in London there's a major capital market program which we will participate in, particularly considering what's going on in the United States under Dodd-Frank and what's going on in the EU under all of the regulatory regimes here, and what's going on in London, which somehow finds itself in the middle, all of which can receive some assistance from a thoughtful negotiation of a U.S.-EU agreement. I believe that also that Ireland is the very best place to start talking about it before going to London. Why? Well, it currently holds the EU presidency, and you have a president that is focused about getting this thing kicked off in an orderly way. But Ireland is a living proof of the great benefits that can come from a free flow of goods, services, capital, and talent across the Atlantic. And we now see this government making many of those steps that many thought they would not achieve. And we look forward to continue our working relationship with the Irish government, while we're also trying to prod, push, and muscle a little our own government and the EU government towards an agreement. Ireland has an extraordinary place in this effort. One overriding reason: they have come farther, met more of the commitments they made, and done it with a sense of purpose and community that others should follow. So I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be in this discussion. I look forward to doing what I asked everybody to do when we ended the last session, and that is, if you go home and wait for June to look in the paper and see if it got done, shame on you. If you go home and figure out who you can call, who you can talk to, who you can encourage, what you can commit, and how you will make a little noise on this subject, you'll have something more useful to read. Thank you very much.
If that's okay, I'm going to stay where I am. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be able to participate in the discussions this afternoon. Maybe I should briefly say that I represent the American Chamber of Commerce to the European Union, which is an organization that speaks on behalf of companies that have huge economic footprints in Europe. Research and development facilities, manufacturing facilities, sales, services, that are part of the economic fabric in Europe, that are vested and committed to Europe, but that are of U.S. parentage and heritage. And I think as a result, it goes without saying that our organization and our members are great supporters of this initiative. But we're not only believe that this would be good for our members, good for the economy, good for corporate America in Europe, but we believe that it's a necessity. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have in reality. And in my introductory remarks, what I wanted just to point out is to remind why this is so important. We've heard it before in the introductory remarks by the officials. It's a large economy. It's a large transatlantic marketplace, $5 trillion US in sales on a yearly basis. But really the interesting aspect of this relationship, this really unique dimension, is the fact that there's such a huge amount of investment on both sides of the Atlantic. And that means that 40% of that big number of 5 trillion is actually achieved by intercompany sales. In other words, by companies that sell to their affiliates across the pond. And that's a very important thing to remind ourselves of, because it illustrates how symbiotic and how integrated the transatlantic relationship, economic relationship, really is today. And I think that, you know, there's basically three reasons why this is important. The first reason for us in Europe, whether you're a company of US parentage or not, but if you're a European company, this is important basically because we need in Europe to find some way to compensate for the downturn of domestic demand in Europe. And I think generally speaking, in the last 5 years, there's been a downturn in domestic demand. Our factories need to run, and the opportunity to increase our exports to Europe's greatest, largest trading partner, the United States, is of tremendous importance. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it is also important, I think, for corporate America. It has been very fashionable, as we all know, to criticize Europe in the last 5 years or so, to announce the demise of Europe. Europe is toast. I've heard it before, and many of you have as well. And I think it's also important to ask ourselves, you know, should the United States, and the United States government in particular, spend its political capital to engage into a trade agreement with Europe, which is today associated with Cyprus, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and much less with other parts of Europe that are doing quite well? And I think that the answer is, contrary to what people may think at first sight, the answer is yes, and simply because of the size of this endeavor. You know, if you look, for instance, at the Trans-Pacific Partnership Initiative, you know, in size, the TTP is 3 times larger, at least, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so that means that the efforts that we can bring on the table are going to generate much higher, much bigger benefits in economic terms than any other trade agreement. So that's why it's very important, also for corporate America in the United States. And then finally, and I will stop with my introductory remarks, I think it's very important for transatlantic firms from a global perspective. You know, increasingly, we are, as you all know, we're faced with cutthroat competition on a global basis. And for us to remain competitive, we need to explore all avenues possible to make our firms more efficient. And that means cost savings, that means eliminating tariffs, but it also means eliminating divergent product regulation, divergent standards, divergent rules, procedures that cause companies to spend more time, more resources on things that they don't really need to spend time and resources on, because the underlying public interest, which is being protected by those regulations on both sides of the pond, is of similar quality. And so this is waste, and we don't have to waste resources if we're facing increasingly global and strong competition. So that's my 2 cents worth on why this is important.
It's fair value in those 2 cents. Thank you very much indeed, Andre. What are your thoughts, having listened to our speakers, and as this search for a mandate and this progress on the partnership begins?
Well, first of all, I want to apologize for my chairman, President Jürgen Thumann, that he couldn't make it today. Unfortunately, his plane was diverted yesterday. We're not sure if it was the storm or if it was a plot, because he was diverted to the UK. So we are going to investigate if there's something special against Ireland here. But he does sincerely apologize, because not only is this an issue that is central to his policy as the chairman of our organization. When he became our chairman 4 years ago, he said, we're going to do a transatlantic free trade agreement. And now, well, we haven't done it, but we're starting it at the end of his mandate, which I think is positive. And we couldn't have done it without AmCham, and especially without Tom Donahue, who really put all his weight behind it in the United States, and I think that's fundamentally important. Minister Bruton earlier on made a rather dubious analogy about this being a marriage, and then it became even more dubious when Mike Froman referred to a marriage between him and Carol de Gucht. So I'm going to add a dubious analogy here, referring to what Tom Donahue said, that it's important that we move quickly in these negotiations. Of course, they're going to be difficult, but we need to move quickly. And earlier in our business roundtable, Ambassador Bill Kennard of the United States, who's the ambassador in Brussels, he talked about this being a honeymoon and how everyone's happy in a honeymoon. Of course, for a good honeymoon, you also need a little bit of action. And so I think the Commission and the US government are going to have to start getting into some action. And we may want to have that behind closed doors in some cases, although I'm a fan of transparency. I think this is going to have to move forward, and we're going to have to advise our negotiators to get a little bit frisky because it's legal now that we're married. And this is going to be really important because a lot of people are going around saying, you know, this agreement is going to be so difficult. We're going to have so many challenging issues around agriculture, around converging regulations, around eliminating tariffs, defensive industries, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, all of those big issues or challenging negotiating issues will be out there and will have to be solved in one way or the other. But the fact of the matter is that if we solve them, not only will we create a huge opportunity for businesses, and of course Ireland being especially, I think, benefiting from that due to all the American investment here, but the European Union as a whole will generate a huge amount of jobs. And Business Europe has done a study when we went to Washington last year advocating for this agreement, showing really the jobs potential of this agreement. From tariffs alone, the amount of additional trade that we will have will create thousands of jobs, and almost equally on both sides of the Atlantic. If we can remove some of these regulatory barriers or move towards convergence, we can create, again, thousands of jobs. And I think we in Europe, and I think Tom shares this view about America as well, we can't skip those jobs. We can't let our people be unemployed. We can't let young people be unemployed like we have today. We've got to figure out ways to do that. We know our governments are cash-strapped in the US, in Europe, so there are only so many ways we can do this, and this agreement is really a huge tool to achieve that.
Thank you very much indeed. Again, who knew transatlantic trade could be so exciting and stimulating? One remark I was struck by that Mike Froman made when he made the comparison between this partnership process and the single European market, and the fact that it needs political will. But there are a lot of critics who would now say that there was an excess of political will behind the single European market. We have at the moment, the world trade talks effectively stalled, so here we now have these developed economies getting together. How much of a risk is there that nearly the political will is looking for a win too much, will not pay enough attention to what you very clearly described, some of you, as the ground, the stumbling blocks that do lie in the way of this deal? I'd like to hear your view as panelists on that. And by the way, in the audience we have microphones, so if you want to join in, please just raise your hand and you're more than welcome to join this conversation too.
Well, I think the point that has been made again and again, and which we heard just from you a minute ago, this isn't an agreement that we just decided to do and sounds like a good idea and maybe it'll help a little bit. This is an agreement that both the United States and the EU fundamentally need to get the car out of the ditch. And if you look at the unemployment numbers in both countries, if you look at and beyond that, to the people that are partially unemployed or that have stopped looking, you're talking about one of the biggest challenges to our global position, which is geopolitically fundamental to what goes on in this world. And there are many other things we have to do. America has to settle its budget deal, which is all about entitlements. Europe has to get the EU to sort of work out their relationships with some of the countries you mentioned, we all have lots of things to do. But putting people to work, driving a couple of percent of economic growth is fundamental to getting the process going. Now, when I look at this from the United States, Europe is the largest export partner of the United States. If they're on a bad slope, not good. When I look at this from the perspective of China, which I'll explain why in a second, it's the exact same thing. Europe is China's largest export partner, and China's got their own problems on economic growth. And going back to the United States, one of our fastest growing export partners is the Chinese. And if that whole triangle finds itself at risk, that's a bad thing. You can come to Europe and look at a whole series of other relationships beyond the three we just talked about. And you will find that therein lies a lot of the hope of straightening out our jobs, our deficits, our debt, our relationships, and our significance around the world. So this is a little different than a global trade agreement, which we sort of decided when we started would take a half a lifetime and take 3 directors of the organization and all that stuff. We got a lot of things done before. There's a lot of very good things, WTO. They're the rules guys, and we still use them all. But I'm telling you, this is fundamental to the 2 trading blocs that have done more to bring stability to this world than anybody else. Others are going to have to come along and do some. But my suggestion is, let's do it fast, and let's do it well.
What kind of time frame, before I bring in Hendrik, do you want to see here?
Well, I think you have to. There's no question when the groups are together here for other meetings in June that both of the presidents have got to stand up and say, the clock's running, go negotiate the deal. If they don't do that, we ought to get rid of both of them. But we can't. So, but they've got to do that. And then, well, you can listen to a lot of people. Some people say 18 months. Some people say 24 months. If you talk to the French, it'll happen in the next century. With all due respect to the French, I mean, that's how they start the negotiation. But the bottom line is we got to do it fast. Just answer this question. How soon do we want those jobs? How soon do we want that growth? How soon do we want that stability? That should answer the question.
But how hard is it going to be to get there? I mean, you yourself.
I think it's going to be hard, but I think one of the first things we need to do is to focus exactly on the obstacles and to define it very well, so that we can then decide how best to address the obstacles.
What are the main obstacles?
I think there's I can mention at least 3 important ones. In Europe, I think we're going to, and as a European I can say this, I can criticize my own family. In Europe we're going
I'll do the other side.
You'll do the other side. In Europe we'll face the usual perennial European issue, which is to ensure that Europe speaks in one voice. I mean, we've heard people reporting about the meeting of the European trade ministers. Tom already mentioned it. It goes without saying that there are other member states in the European Union that are less enthusiastic about free trade than the Irish, for instance, right? And so, in my mind, that will lead to we will need intra-European concessions, we will need intra-European compromises before we can actually start engaging and trying to provide concessions
and can I ask you on that, because in other spheres, unanimity in Europe doesn't exactly appear to be abounding at the moment. So do you think that in this sphere, in the sphere of trade, it's going to be any easier?
I do think it's going to be easier than in some other some other areas, because generally speaking, I think there's support even from the French, generally speaking, notwithstanding the fact that we've already heard about the cultural extraction, that we've already heard about GMOs and agriculture, and these issues I think will bubble up at some point in time with greater intensity than I have now. but we're not talking about, directly affecting the taxpayers or the voters, the money of the voters that the European governments need to deal with in this context. This is in a time of lack of economic growth, as was mentioned. Trade is just one of the very few instruments that we have today in order to achieve growth, where public finances are either extremely constrained or in some countries non-existent, right? So I do think that it's going to be easier than in other areas, such as agreeing on a banking union and things like that. But it's not going to be obvious on that point. But the other point I think that we'll absolutely need to address as well, and then you can talk about the American side, is we will need to engage with civil society and stakeholders in this process who don't think that trade as such and of itself is good, or that it is only going to benefit large companies.
Or who will see deregulation as an erosion of hard-won standards and rights and progress.
Or who believe that if there's an agreement with the United States, that will mean suddenly that people in Europe will no longer be able to access content on the internet, that it will mean simply that we will not be able to import generic drugs into Europe, or that suddenly we're going to throw out European privacy rights down the drain, right? And so we will have to address those concerns in order to overcome and engage very, very actively with the European Parliament in particular in order to overcome these hurdles.
Because it's not just going to be doing a deal, it's going to be, of course, ratifying it. And that's the importance, isn't it? Not just of having negotiations, as you were saying, some of which, if they get a bit frisky, might be behind closed doors. But there will have to be, if this is to actually deliver in the kind of timescale you appear to be talking about, there is going to have to be a public debate. So what role, can the people here in this room play in engaging that debate and engaging civil society in these arguments?
Well, I think debates like this can be very, very important. And the point that you say about regulation is key, because I think there is a misconception about what could be pursued in this negotiation regarding regulation. What companies are asking for instance, is not deregulation, but avoiding double compliance with regulation. So, for example, in Ireland, we've got a lot of production of pharmaceuticals, medicines, right? And of course, medicine has to be checked in a variety of different ways to make sure that it heals you instead of harming you naturally. And so both the US and the EU, they have special tools to verify that the medicines are safe. They also check the factories to make sure the factories are safe. But for instance, when they check the factories, you have the European agency that checks the factory in Ireland, you have the Irish agency that checks the factory in Ireland, and on top of that, you've got the FDA, the US agency that comes over and checks the factory in Ireland. And that's 3 checks. Wouldn't it be possible to do just 1 check? And for the European, the Irish, and the American agencies to share with one another that information that, yes, this is safe, or no, this factory is unsafe. So we don't want it to be less safe, we want it to be equally safe. We just don't want to have 3 inspections of the exact same thing. This is the type of regulatory convergence that really the business community is asking for, and that we think just makes a lot of common sense.
But for instance, already in Europe, for instance, in the area of drugs, we have individual markets. There are people who are very critical of the lack of progress that's been made within Europe, and in fact the inefficiencies that generates in itself. Is there work that can be going on in the short to medium term while these talks are going on to facilitate that kind of progress?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that could take place is that you could have a discussion between stakeholders, regulators, trade negotiators, and the business community about what could be done. And then it could be an open discussion about what is trying to be achieved here, why companies are asking to do the equal level of regulation, just fewer checks and inspections and bureaucratic activities to save money so they can invest that money into research or into production, into job-creating activities. And I think those kind of discussions can be organized between different stakeholders around different issues to make people comfortable with what might be agreed in this negotiation.
And just in terms of those constituencies, and again it was referred to in our keynote speakers, there were so many people predicting that protectionism would be the reaction of big economies, big economic powerhouses to the global recession. And there is still, you know, we hear it daily on our radio programs and in our newspapers and in your newspapers. You know, it is the reaction often of people who are feeling they've lost out hugely in this economic crisis, and they'll be opening their newspapers and reading about these talks and you know, getting worried about will concessions there and opening this, you know, will, you know, progress for the farmer in Montana really mean that the guy, you know, the farmer down in Meath isn't going to feel some pain or get displaced here. So how important is it, particularly for political leaders, but also for business leaders, to address those concerns directly? Hendrik.
Extremely important, quintessential. If we just have a narrative that explains that this is good for business, and we stop there, it's going to be extremely difficult to be successful, at least in Europe, I think. So we need a narrative to explain why, as I think the Taoiseach said it, or somebody else, why this is good not for business, only for business, but also for the people, for the citizens, for prosperity. Now, I can explain it from a economic theory, how by saving my costs, I will, instead of, you know, spending money on getting a third permit for something that I already have a permit, you know, I can put this in research and development, create a new product, hire more people to make it, and create. I can explain this in theory, right? But it's very difficult to go immediately to a voter and tell them this is how this is going to help you. Now we have examples. I mean, one of the things that I think is very speaking in Europe, for instance, just the huge difference in the price of energy between the United States and Europe. If you just look at natural gas, the prices in Europe are 5, 6, 7, I don't know, incredibly higher than in the United States. Well, you don't have to be a macroeconomist to understand immediately that this has a dramatic impact on the ability of European-based manufacturing sites in energy-intensive industries to be competitive and to sell their products. And if they can't sell their products, they can't hire people. If we have a trade agreement with the US, it should facilitate the import of liquefied natural gas into Europe and should, at least in part, have an impact on the price of energy in Europe. So it's these types of you know, examples that we need, I think, that we need to work on, and the business community is also responsible for finding.
And isn't it important, if all those constituencies are to be kept on board, Tom, that we have clear, concrete examples like that? I mean, you were calling on people in this room, you know, go away and do your part. Isn't it important, if we're to connect, that people are given, if you like, bread and butter examples of the benefits? You know, the Taoiseach mentioned 26 million, that unemployment figure in the EU. It's shocking.
Well, the best politicians, the best CEOs, the best preachers are all great storytellers. That's a fundamental thing. If you can't tell a story, you're in the wrong line of work. And you know, if you're looking to sell a product, to convince somebody to vote for you, to get people to join your movement, you've got to be able to tell a story. So just one quick little sidebar story. You know, any of those, you know, we're going to work on this agreement, but any of those companies that want to open up a factory in the United States now because of the natural gas, I'd be glad to have them. But the battle's not finished there in the United States on the energy issue. We now know that we have more energy basically than anybody. But based on what we know, and what we know, there is lots in other places. But we're in the middle of a huge debate in the United States of how to use it and how not to use it. So you remember what happened when we started talking about a global trade agreement? At one point, everybody was saying, hey, don't go out and negotiate any separate trade agreements because, you know, we ought to get this whole big deal done first. And, you know, I wasn't smart as everybody else about this, so I said, the hell with that. Let's go out and negotiate individual trade agreements, and if we ever get to making a global agreement, we'll put them all together. And that's the same thing why we're doing this. We can't stop cooperative arrangements to set up this business, to get a better regulatory way, to build a partnership here, to attract more investment in Ireland. Look at all the investment we've had in the last 12 to 18 months in Ireland. It's unbelievable in all kinds of reasons. There's lots more to be had. We can't stop trying to figure out how to deal with the financial issues on the continent, but particularly, you know, the things we're going to talk about in London next week. These things have to go on. But if you look at the United States, the bumps in the road to get there are, first of all, the Congress of the United States. The Senate, I think, are getting there. I think the Senate is beginning to understand that necessity is the mother of invention, that we have got to drive the job deal, that we've got to move forward. By the way, I would suggest there'll be more investment and more jobs if we're actively involved in negotiating a deal. Because companies like yours and others will say, how do I put myself in a position to take advantage of this? The House of Representatives, which is the people's house, 435 people that may not be experts on a lot of subjects, but they're passionate representatives of their district. We're going to have to deal with them. Many of them see a great advantage. Many of them are worried that we're, you know, sending away our capital and opening our markets. You hit it right on the head. Historically, when there is a bad downturn in economics across the globe, everybody becomes protectionist. They may well know it's a dumb idea, but they have to do it for their constituents to demonstrate that they're protecting their jobs, their markets, right, and their deal. Look, is this thing going to work? I think it is. If we tried to do it 5 years ago or 3 years from now, I don't know if we could do it. Because there wouldn't be the motivation. There wouldn't be, you know, there's a lot of things I don't want to do or I don't believe in, but if the house is on fire, I'm going to, you know, change some of my convictions and get the hell out of here. And that is something that we have to do. Europe and the United States are in serious need of fundamental economic change and improvement, and this would be a major part of it.
So it's the politicians in the states, it's the babel of political voices amongst the member states within Europe, and it's also civil society. I want each of you, in conclusion, to tell me what you think the biggest, just give me an example of the area you think is going to be key to making this work. Andre.
Well, I think the issue that will move fastest is actually tariff liberalization. I know our tariffs between the EU and the US are relatively low, but if you multiply that by the huge volume of trade that we have between the EU and the US, it adds up to a huge amount of money and a huge savings on what is basically a nonsensical tax between ourselves. And that will be probably the biggest short-term gain of the agreement.
Hendrik?
You know, I think I agree, but look, I think what will be very important, it won't be a short-term gain, but what I'm looking at is not only that we resolve these divergences on a sector-by-sector basis, because we're always going to find some divergence. There's too many sectors.
And Minister Bruton said we won't agree on everything.
Exactly.
We're not going to solve
everything.
So
I actually think it would be very useful to agree on processes and procedures for future project regulation that takes into account of the economic realities on both sides of the Atlantic, so that when we have to regulate nanotechnology, when we have to regulate new innovative things that we don't know, you know, the cloud or whatever it is, that we then from the start will have a process that goes into the same direction, and that we then, you know, set up a path for sustainable, common, harmonized regulation.
So that would mean not just, you know, being able to have a process for dealing with problems that can't be resolved right now, but also having a system that could cope with the pace of change in our economies, because this is one of the problems, isn't it?
Flexible,
the rules aren't keeping up with the change
flexible
on
and
the
nimble
ground.
in the same way at the same time.
The key issue in all of this for you, Tom.
Well, first, let me just comment on that. That's absolutely essential. If we started negotiating today, and if it took us 2 years to do it, just for example, there will be fundamental change, inventions, alterations, expansions in trade, investment, and invention all over the world. We're not dealing with a fixed, standstill issue that we can work on. It's a moving organism, and you've got to stay after it. The second thing, the point with me, if I were running this whole deal, and I'm not, thank God, and this was the room in which I put the everybody that was working on it and broke it down into all the things we have to. I'd take that whole back wall around there, and I'd say the first thing we have to do before you get any of these negotiations done, we got to tell the story. We got to change the rhetoric. We have to get people all over the world out there talking about this deal from a holy, let's go do this. This is how we get well. And and there will be the naysayers. God bless them. Bring them out. We don't have to attack them. We have to co-opt them. And if we get to the end and we've co-opted enough of them by showing them, helping them, and there's always a bunch of people that don't agree, ignore them.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank the three of you for having this discussion with us here this evening. Certainly, from my point of view, it's been extremely enlightening. So thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.